for coming to listen to me first thing this morning with such a mouth-watering day for the rest of the day. For those of you who don't know me, I've been a climate campaigner for a quarter of a century, and I've had 3 careers. Before becoming a climate campaigner, I was actually a creature of the oil and gas industry. I taught at Imperial College and did research and consultancy with the oil industry. BP and Shell funded my work on global warming early on in the 1980s, and I sort of jumped ship to... There are lessons that we could and should be learning from the drama we've all lived through, are continuing to live through, in the financial crisis, the credit crunch of 2007, the financial crash of 2008, where we saw an entire giant industry get its asset assessment catastrophically wrong. They believed in a narrative, and I think most of them did believe. There was no conspiracy here. This was human failings in a new narrative of wealth creation with mortgage-backed securities. You all know the outcome of that. They nearly destroyed the world economy. And we should ask ourselves whether, that being the case, other industries could do the same. The more so because there's an explosion of understanding in neuroscience at the moment. And this too is something we should all, if we had but time, be following in some detail. And so in the book I give a sort of amateur's summary of what the neuroscientists say when they stand up and talk at conferences. And the potted version of that is that we are predictably irrational. In fact, that's the title of one of the most popular neuroscience textbooks, Predictable Irrationality. And this they're discovering with massive experimental databases and, of course, magnetic imaging of the brain at work. And so there's good news and bad news in this. The bad news is that we are very prone to believe comfortable narratives. We want to believe comfortable narratives. And when we get into a belief system, most of us, it's very difficult to shift us. And in the case of many people, let's be frank about this and say many Republican Americans, for example, get into a belief system, and if you present them with rational arguments, you can actually drive them deeper into an entrenched position within their belief system. This is what we have to deal with. And we have to deal with an incumbency that springs from a lot of that, and that we're dealing with day by day on the front lines in the energy industry. The experts talk about things like the incumbency effect, where we tend to value things that we have over things that we might acquire that would be better in a rational view of the world, but we create barriers around the things we have, the incumbency effect. We have an optimism bias, that's the technical term that they use. Now, the good news, of course, is that we tend to a yearning for community, and we're much less violent than we're told we are. Obviously, there are exceptions, the psychopaths, the dangerous psychopaths and everything. But, the narrative that says there's no such thing as society, we're selfish animals, we're only capable of caring about family, not anything wider in society. This is part of a narrative you often get from the political right, is being essentially shown not to be the case by these big studies. And that's something we can work with in the climate solver piece. So I take these two things and I look at the energy industry and I come up with 4 big systemic threats. I think there are more than 4, but there are 4 that I concentrate on in the book. And of course, just as what happened with the financial crisis is no surprise to the neuroscientists, it's also no surprise to many anthropologists when they look through history at the way civilizations grow and then die. And very often in the death phase, the Maya, the Easter Islanders, there is weirdness towards the end. There is a willingness to believe in myth systems and to find ways of blinding yourself to the depletion of things that you absolutely rely on. The Easter Islanders and their trees, the Maya, and aspects of water in their civilization. And this isn't recognized, it isn't acted on. But the difference that we have, of course, is we live in the age of information technology. We have all this opportunity to show that history isn't destiny. But make no mistake, as we heard in the Secretary General's introductory remarks, it is the future of life as we know it at stake. It's the future of civilization that is at stake here. And the 4 risks that I'm going to run through, let me just introduce them to you, and then I'll go through in a bit more detail and look at some of the solutions as I see them. We are, as we've heard, on a road to 6 degrees, and there's an artist's impression of that road, and I don't need to spell out for this audience what 4 to 6 degrees means in terms of degradation of the global environment. You're all here today. You need to hear nothing from me about that, but it is worth thinking, coming back to this body of science that's coming from neuroscience. It's worth taking a moment to think about the arrogance that we have, the collective arrogance that believes that we can keep on pumping billions of tons of gases that we know to be heat trapping, all the rest is uncertainty to some degree, into something as thin as that. That's the Earth's atmosphere from a space shuttle over the Amazon rainforest. So climate change is my first threat. I don't think we should call it a risk. It's as close to certain as science can deliver us. The next one we also heard about, the carbon bubble, and this is a picture of carbon as oil, coal and gas on the world stock exchanges. So this is publicly quoted carbon. This is not the carbon the state oil companies and coal companies and gas companies have. This is the stuff that's quoted on the stock exchanges. And the question we have to ask here, how much of it can we burn? Or is it a bubble? Is there too much there? And if it's a bubble, can we deflate it before it bursts on us, like so many bubbles do in the history of the capital markets? And here's another thing to look at, which is the shale story. Is this a boom? Most people in the oil and gas industry, in fact most people, period, would tell us it's a boom, and certainly it's produced some very good short-term economic benefits for America. Or is this too a bubble? One of these bubbles that we're so good at creating. And here we have articles from the New York Times and the Financial Times, rare articles. Most of the press coverage is about how wonderful this is, how it's a bubble, it can a boom, it can keep growing in America sustainably, so it can be exported to other countries. This is the dominant mantra, meme, a belief system here. But occasionally you get people saying, why is it that all these gas companies are losing so much money? If you didn't know this is an important point. The gas industry as a whole in America is losing money hand over fist. Right now it's okay, they can go to Wall Street and borrow more because Wall Street, as usual, is asleep at the wheel and getting bonuses for doling out money. That's then taken back to the shale gas fields, ploughed into the ground in fracking operations, producing yet more gas, which is very low price. They boast about that some of the time, but that low price is destroying the balance sheets of these gas companies. And this, if you've heard this description elsewhere, things that can't be continued because the debt can't be serviced, elsewhere this is known as a Ponzi scheme. Now, of course, the gas price may go up, it may prove to be a genuine boom, but there are people observing what's going on who think not only is it a bubble, but it's a deliberately created bubble. And the lady pictured there is Deborah Rogers, who's an investment banker, and the report on the right, if you don't know it, is her report. Her thesis, and she's not, as it were, one of us, she's an investment banker, her thesis is what's going on here is another Wall Street scam, and that investment banks have driven down the gas price. I'm not saying this is right, I'm just saying this is the thesis of an investment banker, and they've done it so as to feast on the merger and acquisition frenzy that would be the outcome of an industry that had a persistently low price structure in the face of their fantastically high drilling costs. So there's an interesting point here for those of you who are female, and that is in the financial crisis, one of the main whistleblowers, there were so few of them, was a woman. Her name was Gillian Tett. She's the deputy editor of the Financial Times now. She was trained as an anthropologist. She didn't understand what a complex derivative was. Of course, we subsequently learned neither did the chief executives of the financial institutions. But what she was good at spotting as a woman and an anthropologist was male bullshit. And the same thing, I think, can be, I'm not saying it's a trend, but it is interesting for those of you who are interested in female role models as to, who sees what's going on here and who continues playing the game blindly. The final issue that I'm going to talk about is oil, and again we have a dominant narrative from the industry that there's plenty of oil, there's oil coming out of every stratum in the planet, but there are people, many more people than were blowing the whistle ahead of the financial crisis, to say, you know what, it's not about how much oil you've got underground, it's how much you can deliver in flow rates at affordable prices. And when we look at that, what we see coming is an oil crash. And these people come from right across the NGO sector, they come from business, they come from the financial sector. The armed forces have a good few studies, as I describe in the book, warning about this problem. And here's the killer. With the financial crisis, we know of no single person who was blowing a whistle inside Wall Street or the City of London. They must have known, but they did not say anything until it became blindingly obvious. But in this case, you have people in the oil industry itself blowing a whistle. And this is my favorite quote, is from a Bundeswehr report on oil risk. Peak oil is unavoidable, they say. It's all about timing. And those of us who fear that the peak is going to come early, we're a minority, but I'll talk a little bit about the evidence for that and how it can interact with what we've got going. So these are the 4 threats, 5 if you include the continuation of the financial crisis itself. And in terms of the resolution of climate change, getting us off the road to 6 degrees onto that road on the right, whatever it looks like in detail we can argue about, but we all know all these low carbon and zero carbon technologies exist today. Never mind what could be mobilized in the future out of the labs of General Electric and all the rest of it. How do we get onto that road rather quickly? But interestingly, as I shall argue later on, we don't have to get there any quicker than technologies have already been mobilized in the history of technology, the mobile phone, the internal combustion engine, the rest of it. So I'll talk about that. That's sort of the way I want to go through this. And just in case I don't get much time towards the end, I want to try and leave a little bit of time for a Q&A. I've been asked to do that. From the front lines, those of us who work on the front lines find this all very frustrating because we see day in, day out how easy it would be to do this if we just had the political will and we didn't have to battle constantly this increasingly inane incumbency that is defending the status quo. And here's an example of the work of my company. It's low-income housing. We built this with a utility, one of the big 6, SSE, who's an investor in our company. And that's beyond zero carbon, what you're looking at there. The solar roofs, the solar roof tiles that we design and manufacture are providing way more electricity than those homes are using with permanent occupancy. There's plenty left over to charge the community battery car. That's, today. So transportation, provided they have a nice queue to go shopping, and electricity, all the lights and appliances. And on that side, there are 4 individual renewable heating technologies, any one of which can provide all the heating for the development. So this is beyond zero carbon, and we put it up in a few months from the design, the drawing board, right through to connection to the grid. So this is the kind of thing that we can show in microcosm that could be done, and of course more than half the emissions come from buildings in countries like ours. So let me now go through in just a little bit more detail are one by one these risks. Financial crisis are new. I think a good place to start is to remind ourselves of where we were in 2007, 2008. This is the then chief executive of Citi, and this was his defense of his business model. I'll never forget when I read this, imagining using this kind of language to my board of venture capitalists. You know, when the music stops, and things might get a bit complicated, but you know what, as long as the music keeps playing, as long as we're, you know, in this game that everyone's playing, you've got to get up and dance. We're still dancing. And that was his defense of his business model. Outrageous. And, you know, this is what passed for normality at that time, that people were finding they couldn't pay their bills because the oil price had gone to $147, and everyone was defaulting on their mortgages, and all these crazy complex derivatives of mortgage-backed securities were collapsing in value, and panic was taking place in the market, and that's started the credit crunch, and about a year later, of course, the financial crash. Now, where are we today? This is very sobering. What have we done? What have we managed to do collectively to rein all this madness in? People in the financial sector would disagree. They'd say, you know, we've done quite a lot. We've got Basel, we've got other accords. But here's the view of the International Monetary Fund and the Bank of England. This is their frank view, and not amateur analysts like myself. The IMF, in its financial stability report, the system remains just as risky as before the crisis began. How shocking is that? The Bank of England, you know, we've got to break up these banks. We've got to take the casino stuff away from the high street stuff. It hasn't happened. Their expectations of bailout encourage further expansion and concentration, worsening the too big to fail dilemma. And so the whole thing rolls on, teetering on some kind of brink, some kind of shock that can tip it over again. This could, of course, have a big impact on everything that we talk about in climate, if it happens. But in any event, we will continue with this risk rolling above us. The second risk is climate, and here I just want to talk about the carbon objectives. This is, I think, the best way to view the challenge. At one level, it looks horrifically daunting. That peak is going to happen anyway at some point, because fossil fuels are finite, but there's so much of them that if it happens way out in the future, we will undoubtedly have incinerated the planet. It has to happen for most people. That peak has to happen sometime within the decade in which we're living, and then we've got to start going down the other side quickly. And yet, what precedent do we have for any of that? You know, we've had these 5 IPCC warnings, and yet we keep going up the red curve there. So it's daunting at one level, but not at the other when you look at the speed of mobilization required to go down the other side. And I say again, none of it will involve mobilizing technologies, strategies in society any faster than have been mobilized already. The problem, the reason we're not doing it, so much of it has to do with the work of the incumbency in different ways. And in particular, the vast sums of money that are spent by all those Republican billionaires and other people whose belief systems, whose brain structuring cannot allow them to believe in this issue of climate change. And so they fund all this counter narrative, which many people believe because the tabloid press echo it, and you get this sort of war in the media. You've all seen it. This is the front cover of Bloomberg. We fortunately have our own billionaires of our own persuasion, but not as many of them as the incumbency has. And so this is the kind of thing that we deal with. And what is the nature of this? As I experience it, as I describe it in the book, it's complex. You know, in many ways, it sort of looks and feels like a civil war. We now have 10 of Europe's top 10 utilities in Brussels with their lobbyists out in the open saying renewables have to be capped. You've got to stop this stuff with renewables. This is what they've been saying in the last few weeks, led by GDF, Suez, E.ON, RWE, Vattenfall and others. If you didn't know this. And their argument is, you know, the profitability of these companies is being destroyed the top 20 European utilities were worth €1 trillion in 2008. You know what they're worth now? €500 billion. How to lose €500 billion in value in just 5 years? Answer: compete with solar and wind. That is what is doing it to them. And they are now crying foul and running off to politicians and saying, you know what, you've got to get rid of all the subsidies for renewables, you've got to go with gas, otherwise it's going to be a catastrophe for the economy of Europe. And and that gas, by the way, is the solution to climate change. This, of course, is little more than a joke when you look at that picture of the carbon that I've just shown you, but that's their narrative. Others don't care about climate change and don't mention it. But it's not black and white, because despite what I've said, in big energy, there are players within companies and companies within the industry who get it to some degree. It's like any civil war. You have people under the same roof who are on different sides, as it were. Big capital, but not all. You know, lots of the financial sector gets it about what's coming, and I'll talk about that a little bit in that carbon bubble. And then institutional support. I can't talk about a country like Sweden. I don't know your setup here, but in my own country, many of the captains of the civil service, the senior people, are aging men for the most part, and most of them are creatures of the incumbency. They're looking for jobs in the incumbency in their retirement. They go to the dining clubs of the incumbency, and they provide all sorts of problems for those of us trying to do something about this. But again, not all of them. So it's a complex picture. Now, how does this work? They're really good at telling stories. They decide what their narrative is going to be, and they're very skilled at telling it. They can get away with absolutely monstrous things, like, for example, as happened in the UK recently, where EDF has conspired with allies in the British government to, it seems, set in place a plan to build the single most expensive power station in the world at Hinkley Point, using public money for it. And still the opinion polls, because of the blizzard of hype and publicity, suggest that, roughly half the population would support that. They have great influence. So the last time we asked how many big energy lobbyists were in the civil service in Britain as paid civil servants, so their salaries paid by big energy, but acting as government civil servants, the answer was 50. And not one from the renewable energy industries. So the deck is stacked against us. They're culturally coherent. You don't get whistleblowers from inside this. It's very rare. You can talk to people, many of us will have done it, over a beer, and they'll tell you about their reservations. But most, these people don't go to the press very much. It tends to be civil servants who blow whistles. And then there's this default. It's just the default press coverage, with organs like the Financial Times in my country, the right-wing tabloids. Their default is to attack the change because of this, neuroscience setting out, of course, the nature of their proprietors. So 80% of the press coverage in Britain of renewable energy is negative. It's about things that go wrong. It's about how expensive it is. It's about how solar doesn't work in cloudy countries, myth after myth after myth. And there's that kind of default going on. But people aren't stupid. So what's the most popular form of energy in Britain? In multiple countries, of course, it's solar, with wind not far behind, despite all this. In the book, I talk about, people from inside the system tell me things that are going on. And I talked to a PR executive from one of the big PR houses. This was the phrase he used over a coffee. He was guilt-stricken. You do appreciate, do you not, that they're using black arts to try and kill you? You didn't mean me personally, I hope, or my company, but our industries. And this is what they do. They plant these stories just at the wrong time. They get on the front pages of tabloid papers read by 4 million people. And so wind turbine explodes, shock horror. Imagine the mass evacuations, the city's under threat. and it's on the front page of the Daily Mail. This one on the right is one of their great myths. I mean, it's a lie, of course, but it's implanted in the population. Your energy bills are going up because of green taxes. Anyone who scratches a little bit below the surface knows that it's actually wholesale price of gas that's mostly doing that. But this is a myth that they plant on the front pages of the papers. So the transition, as we would like to think of ourselves, the movement for transition, for climate solving, but, you know, to continue the analogy, the insurgency, because an insurgency doesn't have to bear arms, it can be a peaceful insurgency, and also at conferences, the incumbency refers to the people who oppose shale gas in America as an insurgency. They actually use that sort of militaristic language that makes no distinction between the kind of thing that their troops are dealing with in Afghanistan and people who ask questions about shale gas. So, big energy breakout thinkers, small energy companies, there are breakout thinkers in big capital, of course, emerging institutional support in civil service, sort of the counter of what I described in the insurgency. And very importantly, emerging people power constituencies. So, you know, the energy co-ops that are being set up 1 every 2 days in Germany, and the crowdfunding movement and the like. Our own NGO movement and all the people who care about climate change, you only have to go to the climate summits to see just how big that movement is, and progressive politicians who get it about all this. Now, what we can't have with climate is a repetition of this, what happened in Copenhagen. And this is the challenge for all of us in the year ahead. We have to get world leaders in November next year, 2014, in New York with Ban Ki-moon. The UN has very skillfully, I think, persuaded them all to come to New York. And that is where they have to agree to solve the climate problem. Because if we leave it to Paris and the climate summit in December 2015, it'll be too late. It will be Copenhagen again. They won't be able to get their act together. It has to happen in the year ahead and be choreographed. And everyone in the UN is working towards that. That's what we need to do in our different ways. The single most important thing I think that Sweden and Norway can do is to restructure and redirect their state pension funds there. That would send a huge message to this process. And not to do it, conversely, would send a tacit message that actually we're a little bit worried, we're going to stick with the status quo, maybe these utilities who are telling all this stuff to European politicians are right. So there's a downside of not succeeding in that process. So risk-free, and I'll go quicker through these others because I know the climate one is very interesting to you. The carbon bubble is of course related to climate. And the two views here, countering views, Nick Stern at the launch of our last report in May, you can't believe two things. You can't believe that fossil fuel companies are in any way valued correctly, and also believe that we're serious about climate policy making, even though some of us have signed our targets into law, like the UK. And the Financial Times, when our report came out, first report, interviewed a whole load of analysts and fund managers about their reaction to this report. They quoted a series of anonymous quotes. This was one of them. I think it's a bollocks subject. I actually printed that word in the Financial Times. I'm not interested in this kind of subject. I think this is complete hot air. Now, this is an analyst who presumably is university educated. And this is his or her reaction to it. Is there logic and rationality here? Is there a kind of, we've priced in the risk and it's okay because the discount rate and la-di-da-da-da, all that kind of language is missing. This is the language of a deeply threatened belief system. That person is saying, you annoying people, get out of my face. This has nothing to do with my ability to turn up every day and earn a bonus. And this is why they struggle with it, because when you haven't read the report, I've left some copies outside, and my email will go up at the end. You can send me an email, I can send you a PDF. But the little crimson circle there for an 80% probability of hitting 2 degrees for quoted stocks, gives you a budget of 225 gigatons of carbon dioxide. And in currently listed reserves, that's coal, oil and gas, listed on the stock exchanges as assets, as though they're at zero risk of impairment, you've got way more. You've got 4 times more there. And then in capex going out, the potentially listed reserves, you've got even more still. And this is the diagram I showed you before. Oil is black, gas is blue, coal is grey. You can see the big 3 stock exchanges where all this will be played out: New York, London, Moscow. And then this is what happens with current plans to deploy capex and pretty much double the amount of fossil fuels there. So completely unsustainable. Overall, including all approved reserves, only 20% of this can be burnt to have a reasonable opportunity of staying below 2 degrees. Now, where's the vulnerable point here? These are the capital flows of the fossil fuel industries from our report. And the key figures here are what goes back to investors as dividends and what goes out as capex. So Bill McKibben and I class this $600+ billion a year over the next 10 years, when this drama will be decided or otherwise. That's a $6 trillion gamble that climate policymakers are going to do nothing, precisely nothing, about climate change. And a $6 trillion gamble that none of this risk will ever be recognized. It won't be required in the accounts of companies or IPO prospectuses or whatever. Meanwhile, investors never mind about climate change. If you were an investor, and actually most people in this audience are because you're in this pension fund, how happy are you in the face of these kinds of numbers with just 126 billion coming back a year in dividends to you? So the first time I really knew that we had a winning argument with the carbon bubble was when I chaired the launch of this report in the Bloomberg headquarters in London in May. And on the panel, at this point I should say, I'm not the father of this. I'm just the chairman. The guys who are the real heroes are the analysts. So Mark Campanale, ex-Henderson Investors, James Leeton, ex-WWF and PwC. He's the guy who won the award for the writing of the report, and others work in CarbonTracker. It's important to get that historical thing right. We and Greenpeace and others talked about the carbon arithmetic way back, but we never got the traction that this exercise is getting because we didn't speak the language of the capital markets. We didn't know how to at the time. And anyway, no one would have listened to us probably, but these are people from within the financial sector who have broken cover. So, at the launch, the lead oil and gas analyst at HSBC said, and I paraphrase but accurately, you know what, we don't question these numbers, this is right. And if you combine it with the performance of these big oil companies and their profitability, you look at their last quarter results, they're shocking. Shell had to write off $2 billion in US shale. If you didn't know that, that's a very important factor. They've written it off from a $20 billion investment in shale. This is a boom? This is the future? I don't think so. Not in the face of that kind of thing. They came in late, they got the low-grade plays, and they got whacked in the face because the narrative just leapt up and slapped them. Very important argument. Anyway, I digress. What was that? Spedding. So he said, what I'm going to do is go out of here and recommend that capex is not spent on developing new fossil fuel reserves, taking them from resources to reserves, but actually what they should do with that capex is give it back to us as investors so we can do something more constructive with it. He didn't quite use that language, but that was his message. And this is an incredibly powerful thing, because if you think that's one oil and gas analyst and one of the big investment banks, if they all start saying that, what's the future for the oil and gas industry? Now, the big oil companies have formed a task force to deal with this threat under the umbrella of IPECA. They see it as a real existential threat to their business models. Make no mistake, this is the first time in climate change that we've ever had these people on the ropes, and we're landing punches, you know, by the minute. Of course, there will be a big blowback that can be expected, but this is what's happening at the moment. And if you notice what he's saying, what I've just said for about the last few minutes, the word climate hasn't even appeared in the sentences. Now, I don't want to sort of go through a series of boasts about this impact, but I think I'll just leave you to have a look at the CarbonTracker website just to get a feel for the pattern of how this is resonating out in the marketplace, how companies are picking up on it. The Wall Street Journal has written that the carbon bubble has gone mainstream. That was very soon after the report came out because of the blizzard of press coverage that we got. There was an article, an op-ed by David Blood and Al Gore the other day on the carbon bubble in the Wall Street Journal. Amazing. And they have to publish it because it's not about climate, it's about finance. And this is why it's such a powerful argument. People are already pulling out of coal, recognizing stranded assets, Rio Tinto, BHP Billiton. Much of this has to do with parallel events and what's happening in China with the cutting of coal burning. But we've really got impetus here. And this is one of the key arguments for your dealings with your pension fund trustees here. This is the work of Impacts Capital, and they've looked at the divestment case where people start pulling out of fossil fuels as opposed to staying in and investing. And this is what they find in their particular portfolio of companies that they favour. This is what you would have got had you pulled out of all fossil fuels completely. And the answer is a slightly better performance. Not hugely better, but of course if you were to believe the knee-jerk mantras of the incumbency, you would be blowing your investments and shattering your economy if you did this. It's wrong. And so on the one hand, we've got the 350 movement arguing for divestment, and that's a very powerful and legitimate moral argument. On the other hand, you've got CarbonTracker arguing that actually stay involved, target the capex, get the regulators to start regulating and to recognizing the risk, get the individual players across the financial sector to recognize the risk, and you will end up with a very interesting state of affairs where all of a sudden, from the mass assumption right across the capital markets that there is no risk of asset impairment, there's a constant discussion of risk, and that amplifies all these other things that can happen, and that diverts the Mississippi River of capital that goes to fossil fuels to climate solver problems, solutions, sorry. So the last couple then, just briefly, and I'll stop. The shale surprise, you know, the narrative, the conventional narrative is this is a new route to healthy economies, it's a game changer, but the counter minority view is it's a debt-laden route, as one of the industry whistleblowers calls it, to the self-destruction of the gas industry. This is, well, you know, in the same way as the financial sector almost destroyed itself. And there are also questions about whether it's exportable as an essentially American phenomenon, because they can get away with this close spacing of wells. So far they've been able to get away with the disastrous environmental story. They essentially deregulated the industry so that there would be no inspection of toxic fracking water produced, and public protest is definitely growing. That's what it looks like in North Dakota. You know, you wouldn't want that on the green fields of Sweden, I'm sure. This is what the drilling pits look like, full of lots of toxic goo. We can't really find out exactly what, because it's all proprietary, what chemicals they even use. And in Colorado, all this was washed away by the floods, of course, in countless drilling pits. And this is Little England. This is the first well in southern England that they tried to drill, did drill at Balcombe. This is what, to get the kit to the drill site, massed rows of police, thousands of people protesting, just on the first well in the first field that was going to be fracked. So I don't think this has much of a sustainable future. And that's what incumbency offers us, as opposed to what we can do through clean energy solutions. And laughable stuff in the press. The Wall Street Journal one day talking about how the global gas push is stalling. Big problems elsewhere. Water in China. This is very, very water intensive. Whole towns are now running out of water in Texas. In China, they're not going to do it. There are all sorts of other such reasons that vary by country. And the very next day in Little Britain, in the Financial Times, the Chancellor backs gas to fire up Britain. Fracked gas from beneath the green fields of England. How are they capable of believing this stuff, this mythology? But that's what they do believe, and they want to suppress renewables in order to give it a chance of happening. So the oil crisis, finally, is the last one. The basic argument here, again, there are two very different narratives: drowning in oil, or we're just about to run out of oil. Neither is true. Those of us who worry think. Here are the military views, that we do have a problem, and that the American military, the British military, and the German military have all said that. And Americans are acting on it. They have one of the biggest renewable and renewable fuel programs that you can imagine. In Britain, we have an industry view on this, and a pan-industry task force that even SSE are members of, Virgin, Stagecoach. And we said in 2010, don't let the oil crunch catch us the way the credit crunch did. That's still the view that we have, despite the narrative that we're offered from the industry. So let me conclude, because we're now at the time for the coffee break at 10 o'clock, and I'm sorry about missing your questions, but we have a panel afterwards. I think there are a number of conclusions I draw from all this, and they'll be pretty obvious to you. That our future in the energy industry in this decade is going to be defined, whatever we manage to do with rational policy making, it's going to be defined by shocks. A shock or shocks. And that's what I conclude in the book. I think the most likely one is going to come from a collapse in global oil production, not because there isn't plenty of oil, but because of what they put in place in the way of being able to deliver flow rates at anything like the kind of demand levels that we're going to have, given what's happening particularly in India and China and the Middle East. Really rapid growing consumption of oil in these places. So as regards the climate objective, we should keep going, aiming at that climate summit in December 2015, with everything that we can do to strengthen the arm of Christina Figueres and the Climate Secretariat. She has the most difficult job in the world. We may or may not, in the interim, have to face another of these shocks. It could be the financial system going again, or if I'm right, it could be the oil crash. And that, of course, will make things a lot worse before they get better, but it will give us a time of opportunity to really ram home these arguments that there is a way to get out of this that doesn't involve doing more of exactly the kind of thing that got us into the problem in the first place. And that's what's happened so far with the financial crisis. That will really give us the chance to hold our leaders' feet to the fire and get them to, once and for all, go down the climate solver route on the road to Renaissance. And thank you very much for listening to me.
I'm making an executive decision to stay 5 minutes longer so we can get more questions in. Two things, just really quick comment. Number one is you don't have to be an anthropologist to recognize male bullshit, just to get the clear. And number two is that it's encouraging to hear your enthusiasm and confidence in the ability of the mobilization. A bunch of other questions too, which we'll take later on the break. So meanwhile, let me quickly open up to the audience before we take a break. And we have a question right here in the front. Can stand up, please introduce yourself.
Are you sure? I'm very tall.
I'm sure.
Hi, I'm Per Olofsson with Climate Well. So I'm interested in about what you said about the peak well, the oil risk essentially, because what we've seen in Brazil in the last couple of months is essentially with the Batista empire totally falling down from, was it 50 billion down to $500 million. Is that just, how should I say, has it nothing to do with it? Was it just an unfortunate valuation of assets, or is it connected to what you're saying here? I mean, essentially they couldn't get the oil out of the ground and the gas fast enough to motivate the valuation.
Yeah, that I suppose I don't know I don't have a considered opinion about the inward working of that Batista story, but that's the general problem that they have, and their ability to switch to myth and propaganda is their own worst enemy here. So what you would hear if there was someone here from the oil industry is that this is ridiculous. There's so much oil in these reserves. We have 40 years of supply, they say. And this is, of course, the amount that they've configured as reserves divided by the current production rate. And it misses so many things. We're not talking about that. We're talking about the deliverable flow rates, how quickly you can get it up out of the ground. And then, when you talk to people who believe the incumbency narrative, say at dinner parties, and they don't really know about what's going on, a couple of test questions is, how long does it take once they've found one of these oil fields that they read about in the newspapers, giant oil field found off Brazil. How long is it going to take them to bring that to market? It's more than 10 years. And the average is actually 6 years, even for smaller fields. And then another one about this boom in America, the oil shale, or tight oil as it's properly called, boom in America, which has got even the IEA saying, hey, we're on the way to Saudi America, America's going to be self-sufficient, it's all going to be great. And then you ask people, well, how much is that boom? And the answer is just over 2 million barrels a day in a 91 million barrel a day world, in which the old crude fields are already depleting off a peak at 74, 75 million barrels a day and descending at 6% a year. And when people say, what? Crude oil has peaked? Actually already peaked? Yes, ask the IEA. But you never read it in the newspapers. So do you see what I mean? This is the constant thing that I encounter in going about, my work. And this is what we have to try and combat as best we can.
Great, thanks, Jeremy. Our last question, and as we mentioned, there'll be time for more questions after the panel discussion.
Morning, Anders Wikman here. Thank you very much for a very interesting account. Like you, I have tried to follow all this debate, in particular in the US, about the so-called shale revolution. And I tend to agree with you that I see this as a huge bubble. But the counter argument, of course, is all these big energy companies, they must have a great number of analysts. Are they really wrong, all of them? I mean, how can you explain that these big companies are investing so much energy, time, and efforts? I'm just perplexed that the assessments can be so widely different.
It is perplexing, but I think there are two things. It would be much more difficult to believe if we hadn't seen it with the financial crisis. And the answer there was, how could all those analysts be wrong? All those analysts who were giving the investment banks, great ratings, buy. All the ratings agencies who were giving them AAA, ratings for their complex derivatives. And that all happened. And they were all wrong. And they nearly created the world economy, the global economy. So we always have to remember that. And we always have to remember this thing about the male bullshit. So, in the dot-com crash, all the forensics of that have long since come out. And, people have served their time in jail over what happened there. All the memos, the emails that came out, one of them, the memorable one about this stock is such a heap of crap. And that was from the same investment bank that was madly hyping it, persuading its clients to buy it. And there's countless stuff like that in the financial crisis as well, some of which I distill in the book. So we trust at our great peril, these big institutions. It's not to say that everyone is bad in them, and I'm going to finish on an up note by saying, who are the analysts now in CarbonTracker? In the first report, they were these people, the founders, who were brave enough to leave the financial sector and start this work. Now there's an analytics unit that is run by the former head of research at Citi, and the lead oil and gas analyst at Deutsche Bank, Mark Lewis, has left Deutsche Bank to work for CarbonTracker. So when you create the institutional apparatus for people to be good guys, as opposed to just sit there and continue to be on the dark side, then some of them will do it.
So there's a revolution afoot, part of the insurgents. So thank you so much again, Jeremy, and welcome everybody back at, we'll say 10:35, so you'll still have time for